So hello everyone, it's 11 o'clock, so in the interest of everybody's time, I will get us started. My name is Karen Churchill. I am the secretary on the board of directors of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our 5th webinar in a series Agri-Food research and innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I will be your moderator for this session. And I'd like to begin by thanking the following organizations for partnering with us on this event: Farm Credit Canada, AgWest Bio, and Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. And before we begin our moderated discussion, I have a few technical notes to share. The chat bar will not be open to the attendees. That said, you are welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A button. If you see a question asked by another attendee that you would like, you may upvote in order to move it up the queue. If you would prefer to ask your question verbally, please use the raise your hand button next to the Q&A button. And once identified, you will be invited to unmute yourself and ask your question. So today's session is about public trust and decreasing public confidence. So public trust is essential for ensuring the continued success and growth of the agri-food sector. Since the Industrial Revolution, advances in science and technology have fundamentally altered our relationship with agriculture and food. Most consumers are distanced or unaware of the processes in which food is taken from farm to table, and that creates a climate of uncertainty and making space for the spread of misinformation. In recent years, the federal government has worked to address this issue, notably by establishing policies on traceability and investing in organizations like the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity to build trust and transparency in the food systems. Our panelists will discuss factors contributing to this issue, implications for agriculture, food and research and innovation, and recommendations on how to rebuild public trust. So we are very pleased to welcome our panel of experts today. So joining us, we have Dr. Jillholtz, Professor, Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics, the College of Agriculture and Biosciences at the University of Saskatchewan. Mr. John Jamieson, President and CEO at the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, and Dr. Jeff Kinder, Executive Director for Science and Innovation at the Institute on Governance. So before we begin our moderated session, I invite our panelists to say a few words about themselves and their organizations. So if Dr. Hobbs, if you would like to kick us off.
Certainly, thank you, Karen, and thank you for the invitation to participate. It's great to be here. So my name's Jillholtz. I'm an agricultural economist, and I'm a professor in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. So my particular research focus looks at 3 areas that relate to this topic. I'm very interested in food supply chains and the way information flows along those food supply chains. Done a fair bit of work on food policy and in particular consumer behavior. So some of my recent work has looked at how do consumers respond to information about food products? Do they value different types of certification? And then more recently, we looked at specifically how you frame information. So for example, information framed as a narrative, a story, is that more effective than a logical scientific information in influencing how people respond to things like gene editing in crops and animals, to nanotech and that kind of thing. So that's the perspective I'm bringing today. Thank you.
And Mr. Jamieson.
Thank you, Karen. And again, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Again, my name is John Jamieson. I'm actually coming to you from my home in Prince Edward Island. And so we're represented from across the country here. And I work for an organization called the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. And we're a new organization that was established in 2016 with really one sole purpose, and that is to build trust in the Canadian food system, essentially connect the food system with the consumer. And we do that in a number of ways. Most notably, we produce a fairly robust annual research report where we look at the attitudes of Canadians on the food system and track their attitudes on gene editing, GMOs, pesticides, animal welfare, that type of thing. We also coordinate and work with a number of organizations like the farm and food care organizations across Canada, Ag in the Classroom, 4-H Canada, and others in helping to create a united effort to build trust in the food system. And then we're also in the process of launching a fairly robust communications plan. I've been the CEO here for a little over 2 years, and have worked in the industry for about 25 years. Prior to coming to Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, I was a deputy minister with the province of Prince Edward Island, responsible for fisheries, aquaculture, ag, and rural development. So looking forward to our discussion here today, and I'm sure I'll be able to learn a few things along with everyone else.
I'm sure. And Dr. Kinder.
Yes, hello, thank you. And as with my colleagues, I want to thank everyone for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to this panel. So I'm a longtime public servant in the Canadian federal government, previously the US government, so about 30 years in government, and have spent most of my career in the area of science and innovation policy. So I'm not an agriculture sector or agri-food sector expert by any stretch, but perhaps can share some insights around the more general decline of trust in science. And then in the last few years, I have been on what's called an interchange arrangement with the Institute on Governance in Ottawa, which is a small not-for-profit charitable organization, basically a think tank, where we look at questions of public governance. And so in my case, again, looking at science and innovation policy and governance questions. So looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you. Welcome. I think there's going to be a great discussion today, because this is certainly a topic that is coming up more and more, right? So I would like to invite your thoughts on how you describe the current state of public trust in science, and specifically in the agri-food sector. What areas related to research and science do you think are the most contentious today? And I'm going to just leave that open. Who would like to start that topic?
I might jump in just to give the broader picture, and then my colleagues could drill down more into the ag sector specifically, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave this quite a bit of thought, and I think it's a mixed bag currently in terms of the level of trust, in society in science, because of the pandemic. So I think during the pandemic we did tend to look to the science. Governments tended to put scientists and experts out, at the forefront of communicating with the public. And so, and in general, I think trust here is higher in science than, say, in other jurisdictions, like, for example, in the US, where they were dealing with a president who, had some strange views about science. But at the same time, I think the last 18 months or so has shown that there is still a misunderstanding of how science works to some extent, and we saw that play out with sort of the evolution of evidence around masking and people not understanding, why the signals from scientists seem to change about masking. So there's that, and then and of course, I think obviously the last 18 months have given some voice to anti-vaxxers and others who are anti-science. But generally speaking, scientists are highly trusted by Canadians. In fact, the Edelman Trust Barometer last year showed that I think 83% of us trust in scientists, and that compares with, say, 42% for CEOs and business leaders, and about the same amount for government leaders. So when compared with other sort of sectors or other professions, science does enjoy a high degree of trust generally. Having said that, there's also a recent survey by the 3M company that cautioned or sent some signals that should give us some pause, because they found that 58% of the respondents think that scientists are elitist, and 48% think that they're not as ethical as they should be. So some worrying signs out there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm surprised even. So, Jill, What about the food sector specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Jeff at a general level that there's that sort of high level of trust in science and technology sort of overall, and I had similar thoughts about the pandemic. I think the challenge comes in when you drill down to context-specific issues, and that's when you get some people trusting some things, not others. It becomes more of an issue, more nuanced than whether people trust science. You know, at a global level, they might do. I mean, an example might be you have individuals that believe the science about GM crops, but don't believe the science about climate change, and vice versa, right? And I think that's a lot more complex, and that sort of feeds into different cultural values and that influence how people think about science. To give you an example for some research that we recently did, we were doing some work on consumer, I mentioned in my introduction, consumer perceptions of things like gene editing and gene editing applications. And in a survey, what we did, we were interested in the role of information. So we gave people an option of what kind of information they could read from different sources. So we had some very scientifically credible sources, Health Canada, Academy of Science, or they could choose to read information from consumer blog post or the Globe and Mail, a fake journalist we came up with. We were kind of surprised that I think it was almost 80% of the respondents picked the science sources. They picked Health Canada, they picked the Academy of Science. So I found that encouraging, and that again speaks to that broad overall trust in science. But it's that other 20% that I think is the challenging one in terms of what's motivating people to pick different sources of information. And that's where it becomes, I think, really important in an ag-food context. So, for example, we know there's much more trust of the use of biotech in a medical context than there is still in agriculture. And why might that be if the underlying science is really similar? And I think so drilling into what's different about food and agriculture is quite challenging in that regard. Yeah.
And I know the center's done a lot of work on this, John, and you must have some thoughts too about what's the most contentious in ag and food.
Well, I really like the comments that Jeff and Jill made, and especially one of the things that we did see was a marked increase in the support for the food system during the pandemic. And I think that came from the food system being able to pivot very quickly and make sure that our products continue to be on the store shelves. That being said, it is a bit of a mixed bag. So when we drill down, like Jill talked about, and ask people about technologies in food production, they're quite wary. And in fact, often simple facts are questioned. So when we look at gene editing, GMOs, pesticide use, animal welfare, less than 50% of Canadians have support for these technologies. And the interesting piece is that we want technology in almost every facet of our life. We don't go to a dentist that's using a 1950s model of dentistry. We don't go to a doctor that's using, older techniques. But for some reason, we have a comfort level with food production that may not necessarily recognize the science and technology that is used to create, better nutrition, better environmental and other outcomes, better animal welfare, and also better food affordability. And we do know that Canadians are concerned about food affordability, so it's interesting that they also struggle with some of the technologies that we use to be able to enable that.
Do you think that's the public in general, or is it squeaky wheels?
Well, last year we surveyed almost 3,000 people from all across Canada in every demographic, in every geographic area. And, when we asked them, is the Canadian food system heading in the right direction? It did increase, but less than 50% of Canadians said that it was heading in the right direction. I do think it comes from a lack of knowledge. And in 2018, when we surveyed Canadians about their knowledge of modern food production, 90% of them said we know little or nothing about it, which is not surprising, because the farther you get away from where food is produced, the less, the less you know about it, and certainly probably the less you know about the processes and practices that go into producing that food. So I think we hear from the squeaky wheel when it comes to some of the issues, but in general, and I know last week my staff were in Toronto doing street interviews with folks, and you know, there's not a very high knowledge of how our modern food production is how it works.
You know, and I think of the squeaky wheels in relation to social media. We know the propagation of misinformation and disinformation on social media and other readily available communication channels is a major source of concern, and it's contributing to this decline in public trust. So can you speak about the challenge posed by the current information environment, and what other factors do you think are contributing to this erosion of public trust? You'd like to pick it up again, John, and anyone
Sure.
else?
I wasn't sure if you were directing that at me. It certainly creates a challenge because what social media has done, it's allowed everyone to have an opinion, and and not necessarily based on anything other than, you know, their opinion and the ability to express that opinion. So that creates a challenge for the sector. The other thing about social media is that because of the algorithms and the like, there's always a bit of a bias in what your feed is, depending on what your previous activities are. So if you're someone that's looking at something that may have negative connotations around GMOs, where you're going to continue to see that type of thing. So it builds on that. One of the things we need to do as a sector, though, because people trust, and Jeff is very right. In our research, we see that researchers and scientists in terms of the food system are second only to farmers, and very close to being farmers as the most trusted source of information. So if we can continue to cite sources and continue to be open and transparent and actually use social media, then I think we can advance from some of the pitfalls that it has. Certainly that echo chamber that people get into is challenging. The ability for people to express their opinion, and they almost feel the need to express their opinion is where we have some issues there.
You must have some thoughts on this, Jill, since this is certainly about framing stories.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think the way in which we make decisions is called a heuristic. We all do. We use sort of mental shortcuts. And I think a really relevant one in terms of social media is what we call the availability heuristic. People will tend to use information that's readily available and easy to digest, right? I mean, and that's exactly what social media is all about. It's quick, easy stories. And John's quite right in terms of confirmation bias. We tend to seek out information that aligns with our prior beliefs. So that's a significant challenge. And I certainly agree. I think it's very much about telling stories about agriculture, about science that resonate with people, and sort of having collaboration across the sector and across supply chains, right? So that we're telling a coherent story. Often still in commodity supply chains, it tends to be a little bit combative. Everyone's sort of tunnel vision focused on their own segment of the industry, and that's understandable. But if we're thinking about what we're communicating to the public in general, we need a little more cohesive message, I think. But it is, I mean, social media is not going away for sure. So I think it's ways to creatively engage with that medium and provide that information to consumers, and it does speak to how do people respond to different types of information in their when they're looking for things.
Yeah, I would just add maybe two more factors as well. And John, I think, already alluded to this one, but this idea that food is special because it is something that is essential to life, and therefore it kind of hits close to home, and yet at the same time, fewer and fewer of us are actually close to the farm. I know the closest I ever get is when I go to Loblaws and buy my food. So there's that dynamic of it's something that we partake of every day, and yet we don't really understand where it's coming from, most of us. And then the other one, I think, though, is that there is a growing skepticism around some of these disruptive technologies, and I mean, perhaps with the exception of nuclear energy, I mean, agri-food is one of those sectors where we're not starting from a clean slate. There have been high profile concerns in the past around, mad cow disease and bovine growth hormone and glyphosate and on, GMOs obviously. So, and I think it's important to think about how those weren't all necessarily failures of the science and technology. They were more failures around legitimacy and communication and transparency. So going forward in terms of innovating in the agri-food sector, we have to deal with those past failures or concerns as well.
That feeds right into the next question that I wanted to bring up, and that is this, is the erosion of public trust, how it has impacted producers, research, and consumers. If you want to continue, Jeff.
Well, I would definitely defer to my fellow panelists on the producers and consumers, but in terms of researchers, so science policy is kind of where I tend to focus. And I think that what's happening in the agri-food sector is also part of a broader concern about this erosion of sort of what we call the social contract between science and society. The idea that in sort of the post-World War II era, it became agreed that society would continue to fund science in peacetime, but also provide a high degree of autonomy to the scientific community in terms of determining what the research priorities are, how the funding would be spent. And you continue, 75 years later, you continue to hear that kind of argument that scientists are in the best position to decide what counts as evidence and which science we should be pursuing. And there's calls for more support for curiosity-based research. And at the same time, you've got this sort of this post-truth, post-trust reality in society, suggesting that maybe we need a new approach and need to sort of rethink this social contract.
Any thoughts, Jeff? Or Jill or John?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also an additional dimension now for scientists is considering, well, how might the public or the market respond to this technology, or how do we frame this technology? Would we have called irradiation, or should we have called it something else? For example, as a technology that clearly has food safety benefits, but has a name that freaks out some consumers for sure. From a producer perspective, I think it also speaks to the increasingly important role of producer groups. They fund a lot of, they're a very important source of funding for a lot of applied research in ag. And they're also potentially a source of communicating about that research to the broader public. And I think sometimes, tend to be very focused on, again, that narrow perspective. Is this going to increase yield in this variety or increase feed efficiency in this particular animal? And of course, that's really important for producers, but I think some of these broader implications, what are the public benefits from these technologies, which might be obvious to the scientists, but I think maybe the producer groups have a role to help with that communication. Often for the scientists, the incentive systems are not really built there, I think, to communicate those benefits. You're driven by getting grants, funding research, publishing, and so forth, and then that next piece isn't necessarily there. So again, it speaks to whose role is it to help communicate this science. In terms of consumers, I think the other important point is to recognize consumers are really heterogeneous. So it's not all consumers that are concerned about these technologies, but the issue becomes, is it a vocal minority, and do they now start to shift policy? I think that's where we get to a concern, and depending in which direction that shifts. So yeah, a really interesting conundrum, I guess, together.
I think, Karen, what this has done is, in some ways, it's affected the producers, and it may have shaken their confidence in what they do. So, you have to be confident in what you do in order to do better. But it has had an upside in that the sector has started to look at the way they communicate the value of the technology to society, and they do a much better job of that. It has increased the transparency in the sector. It has created an opportunity for the sector to build sustainability plans and to report on sustainability. And I think all those things will advance public trust and as we continue to move forward. So while it has been, it's certainly had an impact on producers, researchers, and consumers, because consumers, again, question, the value of a particular technology. I think it has prompted the industry to do better. And I think the industry has always been in a path of continuous improvement. They just haven't necessarily done a very good job of communicating that. Or they also think about the way they frame things. As I know, if you're talking about hog production, you talk about gestation crates, well, that has a very negative connotation. But if you refer to them as maternity pens, then it's altogether different, but it's the same technology. So it has forced the sector to look at itself and do a better job of communicating the value of what they do. And I think actually that hasn't been a bad thing.
Yeah, communication's always such an important factor. I hear producers feel getting really defensive. If you don't trust me, how would you feel if you didn't have groceries on your shelves for one day? Then we'd see about trust. What about, in terms of policy and researchers, is it impacting the types of grants that are being awarded? I don't know if you've noted that at all, Jeff?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, the federal granting councils are definitely, paying more attention to this notion of sort of the social contract and increasing the role for science communication, knowledge mobilization. In fact, 10 years ago, you didn't have to include as part of your grant application a knowledge mobilization plan, and now you do. And 10 years ago, when that first came in, researchers would often put down, well, we're going to speak to our discipline conference and we're going to publish in our discipline-based journals. It's like, well, no, that's not really what we mean by knowledge mobilization, the broader sort of knowledge transfer. But there's, over the last 10 years, I think we've seen a definite improvement in terms of researchers getting the notion that this isn't just traditional research communication that we're talking about. It's actually about mobilizing that knowledge and helping the users take up that knowledge and use it.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, have you noted it, Jill, at all, impacting the way we're conducting research, where maybe we aren't doing the disruptive tech because we know it won't be accepted? This is my concern.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say, but I mean, certainly a concern, but I don't know. I think I still see a lot of innovative research going on that sort of maybe takes that risk and looks down the road a long way in terms of what the potential benefits might be. And I think it does speak to how do you communicate the obvious benefits? We wouldn't be doing this research if there wasn't some kind of benefit for society at the end of the day, right? I mean, that's the key thing. So how do we think more carefully about how we communicate those benefits more broadly? And I think, to your earlier point, I think avoiding that them and us way of framing information with consumers is really important. So if farmers talking about consumers as if they're sort of some strange being over there, we're all consumers, and sometimes you'd be careful that the knowledge dissemination is aimed at consumers. It's not aimed back at the industry itself. Look what a great job we did with this wonderful technology, aren't we wonderful? Which is great, but how's the public at large, as we've already said, there's fairly disconnected to agriculture. How is it perceiving these types of messages? I think is really important.
It's an easy road to go down.
Yeah.
And also something I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I know.
I have to invite the participants to also jump in here, and please add your questions to the Q&A. Otherwise, I will end up changing the whole conversation. So let me go to another question here. So several measures have been offered to increase public trust in agri-food. And in general terms, those include, but are not limited to, an environment where complex scientific and regulatory information is translated into accessible language to the general public. Educating Canadians on the facts, relating that to the agri-food system, and creating opportunities to better connect producers to scientists. So generally, and more specifically, what initiatives could be undertaken by the public and private actors to increase the trust of Canadians in agri-food science? That's a long question.
It's a lot there.
Mm-hmm. Who would like to start? How about you, John? Put you on the hot seat for starting.
Sure, I'll make a start. Actually, I think Jill hit the nail on the head a little while ago when she said to me, the main thing to build trust is having the industry work and unity to talk about the benefits of the sector. That to me, that's the first step, that we need to work together. We don't tear each other down. We don't build each other up to, build ourselves up by tearing someone else down. To me, that's the first step. The second piece is, I talked earlier about, progress, but the other pieces around that is doing the right thing, but then actually verifying that you're doing the right thing, that you're using your assurance systems, you're using your regulatory system, you're using the tools that you have available to make sure that you're measuring that you are doing the right thing. And then the next piece is to communicate that. It sounds simple, but it's not. And it's really about being open and transparent about what you do, not being defensive. And I also like what Jill said about, and it's easy to get into this, well, we got to talk to the consumer. Well, again, we're all consumers, and communicating our values is really important, because most of us have very similar values. It's hard to find someone that's in the food system that doesn't support, animal welfare, who doesn't support soil health, who doesn't support advancing the lessening climate change, climate impact. So it's really about, to me, it's about measurement. It's about shared values. It's about communication. It's about doing better. But the communication part is extremely important. I worked when I was in government. I worked closely with AquaBounty, which is the company that developed GMO salmon. And salmon is raised on land. It grows quickly, so it uses less feed. 99.5% recirculated water. And they had a really difficult time getting the public to accept those benefits. And I remember asking one of the people in the company, I said, it took you 30 years to get from where you started to commercialization. And you spent a lot of time on the science, but not very much time on the communications. And the guy looked at me and he said, we thought we had science on our side, and that was enough. And I think that's a really neat story. And that science on your side is not enough, that you have to tell the story behind the benefits of that. And I think when we are doing a much better job of that, and I do see industry working more closely together. There's one group that I work with, and it's all the national animal protein groups. And we meet on a regular basis to talk about animal welfare, and they're sharing information back and forth, and they're talking about best practices and their different strategies. And that is how we will advance trust in the food system.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very much about transparent, open communication, as well as, if there are issues, owning mistakes. So, I'm thinking more of a food safety type of problem. So coming up and owning that. So I think one of the challenges is this notion of collateral damage. So you've got a problem in one sector of the food industry and it affects everyone. So how do you get around that? I think it's, as John said, you're working together as an industry ahead of that, right? To build that layer of level of trust and communication with people. And certainly the storytelling element, I think, is important. Our consumer research has shown that people respond really well to stories, to narratives. They're easy to understand, they're persuasive. And yet we also show that people they sort of gravitated towards those more formal sources, Health Canada, Canada Science. I think that's an interesting dichotomy. Those are the credible sources, and yet we all like to read stories. So I think it's hitting that middle point where you've got a very credible source, and we find different ways to communicate those messages back to consumers. And there's lots of cool stories about innovation and how it's improved soil quality and health and so forth that I think we can be telling in that sense.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on that communication theme and drill down on that a little bit more as well. And I also wanted to just say that in sort of preparation for this event to help inform my thinking, I reached out to a couple of colleagues at the University of Ottawa, Kelly Bronson and Sandra Shillow, and so some of the ideas that I'm going to voice are actually theirs, so hopefully I'll do them justice. But I think this idea of communication is also a bit of a mixed bag, because we've come to use the term communications, particularly in government, with an S, which typically means kind of a one-way flow, a kind of broadcast model that, we've got these messages and we're trying to get them out, as opposed to communication without the S, which, traditionally was a kind of a two-way, dialogue and, sort of listening as much as talking. So I also wanted to bring out a few more data points. So again, from that 3M survey, they found that 88% of respondents think scientists should be sharing results in easy to understand language, so sort of plain language summaries of their research. 85% think they should be sharing results more often, and 84% should think that scientists should be working to make science more relatable to people's everyday life. To go back to Jill's point about narratives and stories. So to me, that data is really encouraging, because it suggests that there is an appetite out there. There's an openness. There's a thirst for this kind of communication, but we need to avoid, what the academics refer to as this deficit model of communication that assumes that, the public are these empty vessels that just need to be filled with knowledge. To go back to John's point, the science is not enough. And so, when we use the deficit model, we think, well, if we just present, the science, the evidence, then that will persuade people. Oh, I see you're not persuaded. Well, let me just speak louder then. We need to shift our thinking in terms of that communication model and really talk about, engagement, participation, listening, not just broadcasting what we think is important.
So we have a question on the chat, which is actually one of the classics in this whole conversation, and feeds quite nicely from what we've been talking about. I'll read you the question word for word, which is, I am wondering why Health Canada wanted to increase the level of residue of glyphosate in our food products, with Mexico and Liechtenstein banning the use of glyphosate altogether. No wonder the public has a less than stellar support of our food sector. They recently backed off until a committee next year can be formed. What are they thinking? Oh, I've spent a lot of time personally in the glyphosate story. So I would be really interested to hear your perspectives of how we got off the tracks on the glyphosate story. I know, I know that it is a tough one. But it says exactly what you did, John. We thought science would back it, and it didn't. So I don't know if you want to just do, who would like to make the high level comment on it? We don't have to engage in what is Health Canada thinking.
I think it comes back to that issue before of this is a technology a lot of people are perhaps not familiar with. They pick up a view on social media and run with that, with that information, and it's really, and it kind of gets on a life of its own. So I think that's a particularly challenging issue. And again, it comes back to that point that you might have an overall high level of trust in science and technology, and an issue pops up that you might be less familiar with as a consumer and so forth, and it creates a significant concern. And again, speaking to how do we communicate, we'll maybe talk about this in a bit, the role of government in terms of regulatory systems, I think are a really important one in ensuring trust, and that people are trusting the types of decisions that are made is a really key issue there. I don't know if that's not really an answer, but it's a comment, I guess.
Jeff, I had thought not just, that science would back, but what about trust in Health Canada? Isn't that some place that we should absolutely have complete trust?
Well, I guess I'm from the school that says no organization demands complete trust. It has to be earned on a continuing basis. But I think I've spent 30 years in the public service, and I think very highly of public servants and the role that they play, and particularly scientists in government, the role that they play to try to bring evidence to decision making. But I think, and I don't know anything about the specifics of the glyphosate case, but generally speaking, there is definitely an issue around the translation of scientific evidence for policy decision making and regulatory decision making, where as scientists, we'd like to think that that evidence just automatically carries the day and is the only real input to the decision. But of course, it's not. Like, there are political, economic, legal, potentially diplomatic, social, cultural considerations that a minister or the government has to take into consideration. So as much as we talk about evidence-based decision making, I think it's probably more likely that the best we can hope for is evidence-informed decision making, so that the science is brought to the table and is heard, but it will always be just part of the mix in terms of what goes into a decision.
Mm-hmm. What about you, John? Where do you think we should go next on this particular story?
I don't know. That's a tough one. You could see why consumers would be confused, because I was actually, when Jeff was talking, I was thinking about, I was pretty fortunate to work with a premier that was very much about evidence-based or evidence-formed decisions when I worked in government. And that isn't always the case. So when you have, Mexico and others that may ban scientifically proven product, not necessarily because of the evidence, the people that have issues with GMOs are able to use that in social media and create that level of distrust in the food system. So that is a challenge, and I'm not sure how we continue to move forward on that. When you asked Jeff about trust in Health Canada, we just did a piece of work that where we asked people about the food system in Canada and where they were in terms of the regulatory process. So we know that by and large, Health Canada, CFIA, PMRA, they're less well known, but there is the folks that do think that our food system is on the right track. Many of them will cite that we have the right regulatory processes in place. So we do have a certain level of trust in Health Canada that you don't see throughout other government agencies. And again, there's a little bit of mixed messaging from them when they're starting to move ahead with something, and then they stop and they defer, and I expect there's some election considerations in there among others, and all those activities brought together creates distrust among the consumer, and then you get so I really don't know how we overcome this particular one. And again, science alone is not enough. But again, we get back to storytelling, talking about values, citing the sources, doing the best we can to be open and transparent, and hopefully get to a better outcome.
How about you, Jill? You don't want to start an argument. You don't want to patronize consumers. It's an emotional issue. How do you frame a story without making those emotions come to the forefront? Do we keep hammering with the positives or the whys of using glyphosate, or did our ship sail and we lost?
I mean, for some people, I think that ship probably has sailed, but there'll be another issue that'll pop up and grab our attention and people's attention as well. But I think it's coming back to explaining what the use of those types of products and some of their benefits, and I guess in that sense, I'm not sure there's an easy answer there in terms of how people respond to the science. I mean, we talked about COVID at the very beginning. If we come back to that as a great example of lots of statistics and data are very clear about the benefits of vaccination. I mean, far more than any scientific trial could ever show, and yet we still have resistance among some people that, and that's a really tough nut to crack, right? In that sense. So, I wonder though if because science has had more of a forefront in the last year and a half, whether there might be some benefits from that in terms of people, understand, maybe having a little bit more understanding of the scientific process as we've seen that evolve. I don't know, it's just a speculation, but perhaps that might have some benefits there. But yeah, I don't know if there's an easy answer to the glyphosate.
Well, and even framing a conversation that
Yeah.
doesn't instantly put the backup of whom you're
Right.
speaking to.
Right, yeah, and I think it comes back to not having that them and us type of conversation where we're projecting, as Jeff said. I like that idea of the communication's a two-way street, and what are your concerns, and let's sit down and talk about them, and maybe understand why different countries made different decisions. They've got different regulatory systems. What was going on there? Why are we different in Canada, and so on. I think maybe it's part of that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave has a great question on the chat. Would you maybe provide some examples of some great wins for science communication in ag and food that have won the hearts and minds of the consumer? Well, anyone. Some great examples. See, I'm embedded in farming a little bit, so I think no-till is a great story.
Mhm.
Would anybody else agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but the notion of taking some of these disruptive technologies and applying them to the farm, whether precision farming and no-till, and using remote sensing to conserve water. I think those are good news stories, but they're typically overshadowed by the bigger negative stories. So.
Well, Arctic apples, that is a great one as well. It made me think about golden rice. Is that a good story or not so good? If anybody knows about golden rice, where we use genetically modified techniques to increase the vitamin A content in rice, great story for people, battling with deficiencies in poorer countries, but not all completely well accepted. Is it a good story?
I don't know. I think you're right. Was potentially a great example of a benefit from that technology early on, but as you said, again, not accepted by every institution or every group. I'm trying to think if there's other examples. Science and communication. That's a great question.
And it goes back to it might have been a good science and technology story, but not a good story in terms of communication and legitimacy and public engagement. So again, we have to shift the model from we're going to invent it and then try to force it on the public versus more inclusive innovation approaches that engage with the public and first of all listen to what their concerns are and use empathy and those types of approaches to actually understand, put ourselves in their shoes and understand what their concerns are and what they want.
Yeah, I like that, inclusive innovation. I'll have to remember that one for next conversations. And, a great fact here on the chat that the Arctic apple had a QR code and only 2 consumers looked it up in the first day. Surprises me. And it's interesting too, isn't it, that on one hand we have really active consumers, but for some reason, and I'd ask you your thoughts on why did the Arctic apple not elicit a lot of negative publicity? John, do you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I'm still struggling to find a great example of an ag story that would move forward. I think communications and innovation is incremental. And I think for us to expect a big win is probably not realistic because we are trying to communicate pretty technical, pretty complicated concepts to the public. Arctic apples, again, I think they're, I think they're a wonderful product. It's a wonderful product. I really don't know why it didn't elicit the negative reaction. I think I really don't know. I don't know, Karen.
I think we should have more stories. Maybe we have to think about that, why we don't have more good stories. It just seemed, what a great question, because we really had to stop and think. And I do understand you're sort of nudging the peanut concept too, John, that we have to kind of envelop it all with a good news story instead of having shining stars. But I'm going to be looking for some more shining stars in my thoughts going forward.
I might add as well that when we think about innovation, we should broaden our thinking from just sort of science and technology based innovations to, innovations in business models and other approaches. Organic farming and buying local, these have actually resonated quite well with at least large segments of the public. They're not S&T based, but they are innovations in terms of taking new approaches that to the agriculture world, I guess.
And actually, Dave, you should have been pulling out the fact that me too. The plant protein is also some good news stories in there. What we're doing with plant proteins around the world, even, but especially here in Canada.
Maybe I can just touch on that. I think that's right. That we often think about the agriculture sector as this big monolith, but in fact, there's all these really cool value-added differentiation opportunities where people are not doing it necessarily to downplay someone else's innovation, but say, if I want to market to some consumers that value organic, and I've got the research behind that to improve the agronomic conditions that would be needed to be successful in that sector, that's great. Or, as you said, the plant-based proteins, that's a big win for people, obviously, that grow peas, for example. And I was often interested in some discussions with my students last year. It was all a bit online discussions, but seeing pea-based proteins, that's terrible because people aren't consuming beef. Well, a student pointed out, well, farmers grow peas too, so that's ways in which the sector differentiates, and maybe some of the success stories are more value chain based, that they aren't something we see as a sector as a whole, but they're a different value chain that's been really successful in innovating and in targeting a new market for consumers.
Are we being too humble? Do we need to be shouting from the rooftops?
No, we need to be listening more, is my gut reaction.
Oh, that's interesting. So what about the role of government in this? Is it effective in increasing public trust, or what could they do to further increase it? And how would you evaluate the risk of government-sponsored initiatives being viewed through a partisanship lens? Who would like to start on that one?
I can go if you like. I think an important role government plays is setting that regulatory framework that consumers will therefore trust. So and that's, I think, in Canada, relative to other countries, we do have a fairly high degree of trust in government and the regulatory system. Yes, it's maybe waning in some areas, but to me, that's important. If you trust the process by which a technology has been approved, or you're more likely to be accepting of that type of technology. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is ways to facilitate conversations across the sector. So I think things like the value chain roundtables, as an example, might be a nice example of, it's not a regulatory initiative, but it's something else maybe government does to facilitate conversations within a sector and across sectors. And once you've got those conversations going, can that then be built on for communication more broadly? Is there a risk of it seeing through partisanship? I don't know. I guess with COVID, we saw some of that political grandstanding with some provincial governments, which I think was kind of disappointing. But I guess that's a different issue in some ways. But that would be my sense, is that regulatory framework is an important role of government, and as the first phase.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff.
No, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that when I was thinking about the question, I was thinking the same thing with Jill. Is that government communicating its regulatory role is important. Government has also done a pretty good job, in both in provincial, territorial, and federal government through the agri-food policy frameworks of de-risking some of the innovations that advance agriculture. And the one that I particularly like is the assurance systems program that helped the farm community develop assurance systems around food safety programs, the animal welfare programs, and the like. I think those are important pieces that help build that trust. I think, as I mentioned, I was very fortunate to work with a premier that was very much about evidence-based decision making and communicating, and made it important for us in all our departments to communicate that these were the evidences that we were basing our decisions on, and having that communicated from the top down is also very important. But I think the regulatory piece, that the fact that they had that policy framework, and I know they're in the process of negotiating a new one now, that really advances the sector in Canada. And I know they just signed a similar one in Europe a little while ago. I think it's over $500 billion. But those types of things that de-risk good ideas is a really important role that government plays in building that trust.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. So, but I'll maybe take my response a little differently. So, because I agree with Jill on the regulatory role of government, and with John on sort of the innovation and technology de-risking role, and generally, I think agriculture is kind of the classic example within science policy of a sector that benefits from a government role in doing the basic R&D, because well, at least historically, it was a sector characterized by widely distributed small producers who didn't have the internal capacity to do that R&D, and so it made sense for government to do that in the public interest. That has shifted somewhat with the rise of mega agri-food corporate businesses, but there's still, I think, a strong argument there for public good research being funded and even performed by government. But I'll pick up on John's use of the term de-risk. I think that is a traditional role for governments to help de-risk new technologies. But I also think that there's a growing interest in government taking on these big public missions and actually assuming risk and sort of taking on risk that the private sector is unwilling to do. I mean, there's a lot of interest in like the economist Mariana Mazzucato's work around taking on these big public missions. She points to the Apollo program as kind of a classic example of a big public mission. But the idea now, of course, is I mean, that was a highly technological mission. The idea now is, can we take on these big public missions around public health? And obviously the pandemic has been part of that. But climate change and other sort of these grand challenges that society is facing, can government can help drive sort of public missions to drive innovation to address these grand challenges. So I think that's a role that government can play and is increasingly being looked to play. And then in terms of the partisanship, well, I mean, we're in a federal election, so right now everything's seen through a partisan lens. But I guess I at least take some comfort that we're not, we're not where the U.S. is in terms of hyper-partisanship and division, but we need to guard against, going there, because I don't think we're immune in any way. So let's hope it doesn't devolve into that.
Well, let me put you on the spot there, Jeff. I learned this the hard way myself. It's easy to point out problems. We don't want to go there. What do we do? What's our next step then to make sure that we don't go there?
Well, yeah, and let's see. I'll just pull up my crystal ball here.
Yeah.
I don't know. I certainly don't have a silver bullet solution, but I mean, I think it goes back to, for me, it always goes back to this issue of figuring out the communication and public participation piece. To actually, I mean, we have good examples of that, and we see good examples of that around the world. We need to better sort of institutionalize that within the way we operate here, to bring the public into that decision making around agri-food. And it's going to be messy, and it's going to be frustrating for the industry. But I think it's given where we are in terms of the post-trust, post-truth society, I think that's where we need to go.
How about you, Jill? Do you have any thoughts on what do we do next to kind of make sure we don't head down a further path of further erosion?
I think it's the issues that we've been touching on in terms of transparent communication and continuing to, I guess, stay ahead of issues so that we see something coming up. Is that an issue the industry needs to be talking about again collectively in terms of how we communicate with the public about the ag and food sector? Yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball either, but I think that would be looking forward, maybe the way to go. Yeah.
Well, John, is this not your mandate at the Center for Food Integrity?
Pardon me?
Is this not your mandate?
Yeah, John,
Yeah.
fix it.
To fix it. It is, and I think it boils down to doing the things that we're doing. You have one thing, Jeff pointed out. Communication is a two-way street. So the first thing you have to do before you build trust is understand what people are thinking about, what issues are important to them, and then when you have that knowledge to work on shared knowledge, shared values, and again, I think it's incremental. I think it's progress rather than perfection. It's being open and transparent. It's working as a unit. And someone said it earlier, it's important to put our shoes in or put our, see what it's like the shoes facing us, and put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. It's really only about 10 or 15 years that the food system in Canada has really thought about, first it was social license, now it's public trust, that we really thought about that. I think we've come a long way. And we are getting better all the time. And I think it's really about, again, thinking about what's important to Canadians, and which is also the same thing that are important to the people in the food system.
I invite our participants for any last comments or questions that they might have on this. And also from the last comments from you three, are you overwhelmingly positive that we are going to be okay, that we're going to put our finger in this hole in the dam and stop are we moving in the right direction now that we learned from our mistakes?
I'm optimistic. I think we have learned from our mistakes, and particularly in both our mistakes and looking at mistakes that have been elsewhere. They're a great teaching tool when you look at how people responded to crisis and what went wrong, what went right. So I am optimistic that moving forward we'll continue to do that. And as John said, I think the industry has made great strides, and the sector. So that's something to continue working on. So we'll see how things pan, but I'm not going to be the dismal economist, the dismal scientist. I'm going to be optimistic.
How about you, Jeff?
Yeah,
I'm crystal ball say.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I am generally an optimistic person, and I think we are moving in the right direction. I mean, again, for me, it comes back to this notion of inclusive innovation, and let's get everyone involved in that, rather than trying to think that scientists and technologists are going to just push all these benefits out to us. So if we can pursue a more sort of mission-oriented, inclusive innovation approach, I think the future could be quite bright.
And then what can we do to get involved? You know, your audience is a mix. You've got scientists, you've got people in the value chain, producers. You know, what can we do to help you fulfill your mandate at the Center of Food Integrity? And how can we amplify those stories?
Well, I think, you know, inviting me to participate in forums like this is a great first step, and highlighting the fact that public trust is an important factor. You know, when Dominic Barton wrote his report a few years ago on the Canadian economy and where we could grow it, he said that agri-food in Canada has the potential to be one of the most important sectors over the next 20 years. And we have all the right ingredients to produce safe, nutritious, and wholesome food. I'm, you know, paraphrasing. But the most important ingredient that I think he talked about when he said Canada has all the right ingredients, the most important ingredient is trust. And the fact that we recognize that we have to work collectively to build that trust, I think is important. I have a small team that works with me. We can't do it all ourselves. And the fact that we need to work as an industry, that we need to support each other, that we need to think about what the consumer is thinking. I think we're, like, when we asked about being optimistic, I think we're heading in the right direction for sure. And when you know, we hosted a meeting last week with a group of people that normally would be competitors, and you know, they rolled up their sleeves and they said, okay, we're going to work on a particular project. And that to me will spell success for the Canadian food industry. And when we spell success for the industry, that means we sell more products, and we have less food insecurity, we have better food affordability. There's all kinds of good outcomes. So I think we're heading in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, Jill, any thoughts on how we can help your participants? Maybe I'm going to make all our participants volunteers for you. What would you have them do?
I guess it comes back to that notion of two-way communication again. One other point that I might make in terms of why I might be optimistic, as John was talking, I was just thinking about this, that I teach undergraduate students in agriculture, agribusiness. They're the next generation, I think, of industry leaders. And I'm struck by the degree to which they're very engaged in these issues and interested in public perceptions of agriculture, sometimes with some frustration, but not always. And I don't think I would have seen that 10 years ago. I think that's a sign of where the industry is going. And I think seeing that kind of, I've had some really interesting discussions with the students about these types of issues in the last year or two, and that gives me some optimism, because we're thinking about the leaders of the future for the industry. That's the leaders. So I think they're all thinking about how they can contribute to this type of debate and how they can contribute to the stories that are told about agriculture and science. So anyway, just throw that out there.
Well, we have a question in the chat that you can all read. It's kind of a long one, and the first part is it's referring to the UN FAO report called Livestock's Long Shadow and the incorrect facts, and that advocacy groups still use to call for an environmental tax on beef. Rather than reading it all out, since we all can see it, I will go to the question. So you can't unring the bell. How do we stop incorrect information from getting published and getting in place? Whose responsibility is that? That is a great question. Mm-hmm. I always look at you front and center on my screen, Jeff.
Well, so I don't know the details of that particular case. Usually international organizations are very careful with what they put out. I don't know the details here, but was it subjected to peer review? Could the peer review have been a broader kind of review to make sure that these types of issues are addressed before something gets published? Because the questioner is totally right that once it gets out there, it's so hard to pull it back. I mean, just look at the, you know, the famous article that led to a lot of people thinking that, you know, vaccines cause autism, and, you know, that paper had been retracted and denounced, you know, for years, and yet it's still kind of circulating out there. So it is hard to pull something back. So we need to do as much as we possibly can to make sure we get it right before things get published. And then I guess after the fact, it goes back to this whole issue of trust. Like, if, you know, if we do things that help build the trust, then maybe it is easier to try to correct bad information or misinformation. I assume this was an issue of misinformation rather than nefarious disinformation, but
Yeah, and the autism is a great example. Another one I might suggest as a great example is the classification of glyphosate as a possible carcinogen, along with, what was the article, yoga pants or yoga mats and a few other things, bacon.
I'm not giving up bacon.
Well, we'll give up. Yeah, it's true. So, Jill, John, any thoughts?
I guess I agree with Jeff. I mean, that's the importance of peer review, and you know, we hope that peer review process works well in a scientific journal sense. Sometimes it doesn't, but how, you know, once you've got a story out there that's that, even though it's debunked, can be challenging. I think there's also a role maybe for communication with the traditional media. Sometimes they're a source, you know, often if you talk to journalists, they're having to cover all sorts of issues, and they're an expert for 1 minute on a topic, and then they're writing a story that people are going to read. So you know, we sometimes see quite well-informed science correspondents, and that's great because they're the conduit with the public, but who hopefully wouldn't repeat the story that was known to be debunked. But that's not always the case as well. So
You know, that is,
you know, it comes, yeah, but you know, how do you retract? How do you counter some of these issues that have been out there, or stories that, or research that's been shown to be false? Is a pretty challenging question, I think.
it is, you know, accountability in journalism. Maybe that's one thing we should lobby for.
Well, again, I think it's again that two-way communication. It's not just throwing information at journalists. It's, you know, talking about our science and what we do, and helping them, you know, communicate those stories, I guess, accurately.
Yeah, and great point, Sylvain. All right. Well,
Oh, sorry.
no,
I was just going to say, you can't unwind the clock, but sometimes there are lessons to be learned. And when Jill talked about traditional media, so a little while ago, Canadian Cattlemen's Association got a call from the CBC, and they were talking about Epicurious' decision not to carry any new beef recipes because of the impact that you know, the thoughts of the beef industry has a significant impact on climate change. And to their credit, they said, you know, we're not going to speak to this, but if you want to talk to an unbiased third party, and I ended up doing the interview. And I interviewed with CBC, and I talked about, you know, there's a whole lot more factors, and I talked about soil health and a variety of things. And it was much better accepted coming from me talking about the real impact of Canadian beef on climate change than it would have come from the industry association itself. So sometimes there's lessons to be learned there. It's hard to unwind the clock, but you can work with the traditional media, but you also have to think about who delivers the message. And we also know that in science and scientists and researchers are also very well respected. And that's also another tool we can employ to kind of combat some of that misinformation.
great points. Great. Actually, keep going on this topic for a long time. It's sort of near and dear to a lot of our hearts, and we know how important it is. But I will respect everybody's time and thank the speakers and our attendees for joining us today and making it a lively conversation, and one that we want to continue. We also invite everyone to visit AIC's website and register for the 6th webinar scheduled for September 23rd, where we discuss silos of excellence and overcoming divisions in the sector, which is where we're kind of ending our topic on too. So thank you again, and hope to see everyone on the 23rd. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.